Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome you back, Narelle, to the Menai Wildflower Group.
Hi.
Hi, Narelle.
Hi. And now, Narelle Happ is a garden designer and a horticulturalist. She's had over a decade of experience. She specialises mainly in native garden and permaculture design through her business, A Garden for Life. So I'm very happy to welcome Narelle tonight to speak to us on edible native plants.
Thank you. Good to see everyone, even if remotely. It's a bit sad we couldn't be together, but I think this is my new life now. Yeah. I've got a whole lot of plants with me, and it's going to be a bit of a shame because you can't touch them and you can't taste the beautiful food that I usually bring with the native plants. But hopefully we'll be able to get an idea, and you can come and see me at the nursery anyway. I'm still there after 13 years at Sydney Wildflower Nursery. I still love working there. And it's been hard because with the virus, we found everyone was loving their gardening so much because they were stuck at home that a lot of the wholesalers and the growers are actually out of stock. They're worried about spring, about everything being too small. So it's sort of, the bush weeds is not too bad, but it has limited some stock, which is quite interesting. But it was really nice to see so many people coming in and using their time to create beautiful gardens, people that hadn't even gardened before. So that was a really nice experience, actually. It was probably the positive spin on this whole virus lockdown. So can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Yep, that's a yep. So one of the plants that I bought with me, or I've got at home with me, and I just thought I've got nice plant themed paintings as well. Astroloma humifusum has made it back into the nursery. Has anyone grown that before? You can just nod or shake your head. It's a native cranberry, and it basically is it's only about 30 centimeters tall by about 1 meter wide. Loves good drainage, but it gets these beautiful red tubular flowers in sort of spring, late winter, spring, and then it's followed on by a green fruit that's actually edible. So it's a really beautiful little plant. It's quite spiky. I mean, it's hard for you to tell because, you know, we're on Zoom and I can sort of put it forward a bit, but it really requires good drainage though. I've seen a lot of people put this in and then come back to me and say that it's actually rotted out. So just make sure that you've got really super good drainage for this plant. So that one's come back. It disappeared for a couple of years because I think they had trouble with propagating it, and now a beautiful nursery down in South Australia, which seems to be where all the growers of the bush foods are. There's a few up in Sydney. There's Indigigrow. Has anyone been to Indigigrow? That's a nursery. It's a totally Indigenous run nursery at La Perouse.
Right.
They've been sort of setting up for the last couple of years, and now the public can actually go there. So that's been fantastic for the industry, and they've got a really, really good range and a lot of Indigenous knowledge, which is really fantastic. Yeah, so other than that, I thought I'll just talk about some of my favourites and maybe some of yours. So we'll see how we go for time. You can put a big stop up for me if I talk too long, because I get a bit excited when I talk about the bush foods. I've been going to a lot of schools and a lot of preschools and a lot of community groups who are getting funding now to put in native gardens, which is fantastic. So the bush foods has really hit a new high. So, which is fantastic, because when I hear so often people talking about superfoods from overseas, you know, they'll talk about goji berries or all these other things, but we've actually got our own superfoods here. So, you know, the more knowledge we get and the more shared by a lot of elders. I have a lot of elders that I have as mentors, and they are really happy. Does anyone know Noel and Trish Butler? They come into the nursery quite a lot, but they lost their whole 100 acres in the fires. And they, so far, I think they've planted back in already 1,500 trees. They put a list, and people were, instead of money, were donating plants to them so they could start regenerating their land, which was quite amazing. So, and Noel's always, he said, I just want people to grow it in their gardens and start to eat it and start recognizing these plants, because there's sort of a lot of the plants I think were in people's gardens anyway, but people didn't realize they could eat them. So it's sort of it's really quite interesting how it's evolved. But midgeonberries are probably one of my favorite little plants, Ostramurtis dulcis. So I've got like a little group here. I'll sort of hold them up a bit. So I've got Ostramurtis dulcis, this one, which has kind of got a broadleaf. I know it's hard to see from there. And then there's Ostramurtis tenuifolia, which has a March finer leaf. And then they crossed the two and they got the Ostramurtis coppertops. And the coppertops actually seems to have the most prolific fruit. And it's also got a beautiful sort of bronzy tips to the plant. And it has leaves a bit more like the tenuifolia, a bit finer. So I found these are incredibly hardy, and what I love about a lot of the bush foods is they grow in the shade, because so many people say to me, oh, I've got shade, I can't grow anything. But I mean, at the nursery, the next time you're there, the Ostramurtis dulcis is growing really prolifically under the casuarina in the corner of the garden. And you know how usually casuarinas don't like anything to grow underneath. Well, the Ostramurtis dulcis is growing beautifully in there. So in summer when it fruits, you'll catch me weeding that section quite a lot because I get to eat the fruit at the same time. So they're all about, the tenuifolia goes up to about 1 metre, and that makes a beautiful little hedge. The dulcis and the coppertops are about sort of 40 centimetres to 50 centimetres and scrambling. And the beauty of the dulcis is you can actually anchor some of the branches down to the ground and it will set roots. So you'll get extra plants, which you could then either transplant or they're just quite happily being rooted next to each other. But it's what grew from one plant in the nursery is now probably about 2 metres wide because we kept doing that. We were anchoring the branches down. So it's a beautiful little fruit. Has anyone tried it? You can nod or shake your head. No? Yes, there's a few yeses there. It's hard to describe the flavour, isn't it? It's sort of a cinnamon cross eucalypt cross something else. People often ask me what's it taste like, and it's kind of like when people say, what does crocodile taste like? People say it tastes like chicken. Well, it's got its own taste. You really need to have a try of it. One of my other really big favourites, I have a few favourites, but I've got a few that are kind of my, I guess, top 5, is the pepper bush. So the Tasmania pepper bush. So the reason I've got 2, if anyone didn't know, is they need a male and a female plant to get their fruit. So there's quite a few edible parts of this plant. So the fruit, when it's fresh, is really quite sweet. When I was in Tasmania, I had pepperberry ice cream and it was really delicious. Then when it's dried, and it's going to be hard to, you probably hear it, I'm going to shake that. I've dried it and it goes into sort of like a peppercorn that you can then put in your pepper grinder. It has a little bit of heat to it, so if you love pepper, then it's a really beautiful one. When I go to schools, I get the kids to try that, and they're usually all dashing for their water bottles because it's a little bit spicy. But also the leaf is edible and spicy. So when you eat the leaf, I say to people, only try about 1 centimetre because it's quite hot. And they'll say, oh, that's not really hot. And then I say, just wait for about 1 minute. And after about 1 minute, it starts to creep around your mouth, the flavour. So kids were playing tricks on their friends. But I use it often like a bay leaf as well. I'll just chuck a leaf into a dish I'm cooking and it gives it a really beautiful flavour. Now, these hated last summer. I did get quite a few people coming back to me saying they died because they had them in the sun. So I grow mine in deep shade. And although it'll grow slower because its potential is 2 metres, mine's sort of hitting about the 70 centimetre mark, and that's after about 5 years. So it's a bit slow, but I don't need it to be a big shrub. I only need it for the leaves. It gets beautiful flowers. If you're really into finding out how you know male and female, there's a whole YouTube clip on the flowers. So if you've got nothing better to do. But also there's another variety of that pepper bush, which is called Insipida. And you can see that has much longer leaves, like if you compare the two. And Insipida has the male and female flowers on the same plant. So you don't need 2 of those, but the flavour isn't quite as nice. So I just find the Tasmania lanceolata is a much nicer plant. And it has really beautiful, I know it's really hard for you guys to see from there, but it's got beautiful red stems. So it's quite attractive. But it's a really special part. Has everyone heard of Vic Cherikoff, who's written a lot about bush foods? He wrote a book And there's a lot of these species throughout New South Wales as well, even though a lot are from Tasmania. And there's a big plantation in Braidwood. Oh, I'm going to lose my voice now. But there's one up north, up near Darwin, and if you distilled the oils of the plant, he said it would create a hallucinogenic drug. So we can't get that one. It's not in production because it'd be a bit unhealthy. So on from there, I really love, and you're probably super familiar with these, but I love the Prostanthera family. So I wish you could be here and smell this, because everyone knows what Prostanthera incisor smells like. You all know that beautiful smell. Well, Prostanthera incisor and Prostanthera rotundifolia are the edible Prostantheras. So I love incisor because I think it has a really beautiful smell, and when the breeze blows, you get this really beautiful fragrance of mint. And if you're very susceptible to mosquitoes, this is a really good one to get a couple of little branches and rub it between your hands. And if you rub it on your skin, the mosquitoes will leave you alone. So for me, it's like a natural bug spray, if you like. It's used like a thyme or an oregano, so you can just chop it up and use it like that. And for me, this plant, along with, say, Indigofera, is kind of like really heralds the start of spring for me. Like when the purple flowers start to come out, Indigofera is often flowering at the same time. And that to me says spring's finally arrived. It's like it's just got warm enough for the plants to start, you know, really coming into their own. Rotundifolia is more like, it's called native sage. So that's quite a beautiful, not quite as strong a smell, but it's a beautiful little plant. I like the rounded leaves on it. I think it makes a really pretty shrub. Now these guys do need a good cutback after flowering. I find that if you don't, they just get really leggy, and then people say, oh, they don't last very long. So I think the more you sort of tip through and cut it back, like we've got one at the back of the nursery of incisor, and when you come in, I've pruned that a couple of times. So just to keep it really nice and bushy, because otherwise the Prostantheras I don't find last an extremely long time. I don't know if anyone else got more than 10 years out of theirs, but they sort of seem to die off a little bit. Some of the other ones that I really love that you could use is the sort of the rooting ones where you use the tubers under the ground. So has anyone read Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe? Has anyone read that book? So amazing book. He's written a children's book as well, and he has an amazing podcast. He was on 702 Conversation Hour. He's got there's a series coming out about this book as well, and he basically writes about how the Indigenous people were actually farmers as opposed to just hunters and gatherers. So he talks about all the seeds that they saved, and how they were farming a lot of these sort of underground tubers rather than just hunting and gathering. I think once you read this, you'll want to hand it on to all your friends. It's quite an interesting book with lots of information. But he's been doing a lot of trials with a lot of the tubers and some of the grains, because he's sort of saying, well, we need to get these into our market, because basically we're eating all these other grains. Like if you think about wheat, for example, wheat takes a lot of water. And it's only got one yield a year, whereas say the themata, the kangaroo grass, that has 2 yields a year, doesn't need extra water, and the grain is gluten-free. So it's like this fantastic grain that hopefully they're hoping that we'll be able to use quite readily. And he's doing big trials in Victoria at the moment so that we'll be able to produce that grain and then use it as a flour, and we'll be eating the bread. If you're ever lucky enough to hear him speak, he often brings the bread with him. So you can try the bread for yourself, and it's really delicious. So, but with a lot of the underground tubers, so this one's a yam daisy. Has anyone heard of that? The Microceros lanceolata. So it looks like when it grows, I'm sure people have pulled them out before. They look a lot like a dandelion. So they've got sort of a bit of a serrated leaf. It's really quite hard to see here, but it gets a yellow flower that looks a bit like a dandelion. But the funny thing is the flower droops down until it gets a bit of seed. So basically they use the tuber under the ground, and it's really quite nutritious and quite good carbohydrates. So they're trying to actually farm this at the moment so that we can actually start growing it in the shop. So instead of your sweet potatoes and your potatoes, you'll be able to buy these yams, which were really big, huge part of their diet. But what happened is these grew in a sort of a symbiotic relationship with bulb vines and some of the chocolate and vanilla lilies. And there was a moss that kept the soil moist under the ground. And obviously when the first settlers came in, they had sheep and they had cattle. The sheep would stamp around on the moss, which would sort of kill the moss off. And so then the moisture disappeared, and then the sheep would also eat the plant to the ground. And so a lot of these big areas where it was growing, it all dried off. So that's why they're starting to farm it now, obviously in areas where they don't have sheep. Anyway, so that and the chocolate lily and the vanilla lily, so the arthropodiums, they too can be used that way, where you would sort of use the yam under the ground, but you wouldn't have to take out the whole plant, which is good. So everyone can still hear me, can't they? Yeah? Yeah, it's all good. The other one is native ginger. Is anyone growing the alpinias in the garden? No nods there. So the alpinia, and I particularly love this red back, because if you can see on camera there, the beautiful red backs on the back of this ginger, not only is it an attractive plant to put in your garden, but it's got a couple of edible parts. So it has a blue fruit, so it'll start out green and then the fruit turns blue, and it has quite a hint of ginger, and that's an edible fruit. But also the root under the ground, like you would cook with your ginger in your Asian cooking, you would use native ginger the same. So it does like a sort of a shady moist position, but it grows into quite a big clump. And again, they would harvest the root without actually pulling the entire plant out. They also use the leaves, because the leaves, when they're fully grown, are quite large, like they're, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times the size of these leaves. And they used to weave the leaves together, and it could often used as a temporary shelter. So they sort of had a multi-use in a way that to me is like a permaculture way, where all the plants have multiple uses. And for me, when I'm designing someone's garden, like this would look beautiful in a shade area because it's attractive, but then I said to people, you can also eat it. So you've got sort of these multi-uses. I went on the radio on 3AW on the weekend in Melbourne, which I thought was quite funny, because I said, I'm not from Melbourne, so I'm going to be giving advice that I usually give to Sydney people. But people were asking about hedges, and I said, why don't you use lemon myrtle, because lemon myrtle makes a beautiful hedge. And then you can use the leaves at the same time. And people are like, oh, I didn't even think you could do that. But lots of the native edibles make a great hedge. Like Podocarpus alatus, the Illawarra plum, makes a beautiful hedge. It is quite slow. I don't know if anyone's grown that before. It is excruciatingly slow. And also, if you want the fruit, you need a few plants, because they also need a male and a female plant. And so far, it seems that no one who's producing that plant seems to be able to tell which is which. So you've sort of got a bit of potluck going on there. Then we get, obviously, the myrtles are really up there for me. Like, I love lemon myrtle. I think lemon myrtle is, and I wish that you could try some of the food. When I normally do the workshop face-to-face, if any of you came last time, you'll remember I make lemon myrtle shortbread. So basically what I do is I'll chop a branch off the lemon myrtle and I'll hang it and I'll let it dry. And then once it's dry, I can crush it up, and it's sort of, it's hard to tell, I know, but it sort of goes into a tea type consistency. And then I also have a spice grinder where I can grind it into sort of like a powder. And then I can use it in all my cooking, and it makes the most incredible cheesecake. I'm doing a workshop up in Sydney on Saturday, and I'm going to be taking lemon myrtle cheesecake with a wattle seed crust. So the people will get to try that. But lemon myrtle doesn't need to grow to the huge tree that it wants to. You can actually keep it quite small, and it really loves a pot. So if anyone's working in pots and they can't put a big tree in the garden, that's absolutely fine. It grows really beautifully in a pot. Just remember to use your native potting mix and to mulch the top of the pot. If you don't mulch the top of your pots, it can become hydrophobic, and then you lose all your moisture. But it's it really, really responds well to pruning. I mean, the one in the nursery behind our little office is about 12 meters tall, so it's fully grown. But there's one that's growing in the shade, and it seems to have grown about half that size. So it does take full sun or shade. And in that same family is also the aniseed myrtle, which has quite a different leaf. It's got an undulating leaf, has a really beautiful aniseed flavour, makes a gorgeous tea, and it was really good for digestion. So on the lemon myrtle note, they're doing a lot of studies at the moment for uses with that plant with cancer treatment. So there's been quite a lot of trials going on with that plant, which is fantastic. So the aniseed myrtle, it's a bit shorter and it's a little more temperamental, but it really loves a sort of rainforest type environment. So it grows a bit shorter. I find it's sort of more 3 to 4 meters in Sydney, but it's a beautiful little tree. And then there's the cinnamon myrtle. So the cinnamon myrtle is sort of a 6-meter tree. Mini cinny's 1.5 meters. So if you really can't fit something in and you want a little cinnamon myrtle, you can now get the little dwarf. It's, again, you would just dry the leaves and you crush it up and you can use it in the place of cinnamon like you would in your cooking. But they're all beautiful plants that get these beautiful creamy yellow blossoms, and they can take sun or shade. So it doesn't matter what conditions you have in the garden, they can take either, because we've got them growing in the nursery in a couple of different places and they seem to be doing really well. So that to me is one of my must-haves in any garden. I've just moved to a new garden and that's going to be one of the first ones that goes in for sure, is that lemon myrtle. Also, so the other group of plants that I really love is saltbush. So is anyone growing saltbush? No? So saltbush, I love, this is one's a triplex numularia. I don't know if you can see, I know it's really hard with this camera, but it's got beautiful grey foliage. And as far as garden design goes, I love having grey in the garden, because to me, your garden should look beautiful all the time, even if it's not flowering. Like, I really love the different foliage contrasts, and I think it makes a really big difference. This one is super tough. And I always say to people who come in, because some people come to the nursery and they say, oh, I can't grow anything. I said, well, give this one a go. It's either that or pig face. And if you kill this, then yeah, maybe you've got a point. Maybe you're finding gardening a bit tough. But the saltbush loves dry, well drained, full sun, really hardy, makes a great little hedge. It only grows to about 2 meters. But again, you use the foliage. So I would just cut off some foliage, hang it up, let it dry, and then I turn it into a little, grind it up, and it sort of becomes a little spice. And you can use it I use it a lot in quiche and things like that. And I also, when you come to one of my workshops, I'll make saltbush damper, and we usually have that with a lily-pilly jam. And it's really, really delicious. It's got, when the kids smell it, they usually tell me it smells like kangaroo food, because you know when you get those little bags when you go to the zoo. But that's because it's quite a herb type smell. But this foliage is just really beautiful. But there's lots of different ones in that family. So there's like rhagodias, and the rhagodias get the little tiny red berries that you can eat as well. And then there's Inardia. There's a huge group that gets called saltbush basically, but this numularia is definitely one of my favorites. I remember I was down in the my brother lives on the Great Ocean Road, and we were down there, and I was giving the kids berries from one of the saltbush down there, and a lady next to me said, should you be giving your children those red berries? They could be poisonous. I said, that's okay, I've worked out which one it is. But it's interesting where you go throughout Australia, there's different saltbush for different areas. So next time you're down by the beach, you'll usually see quite a few different saltbush. I know I'm down near Wollongong, and the Inardia Hastata is growing down on the beach really beautifully. Like, it looks super healthy. So it's a very tough little plant. Moving on, speaking of beach plants, now I know you all know carpet Brotis, the pig face. Does anyone eat it? Any nods there? No nods? This was a really special plant to the Indigenous people, because they, not only was it great for moisture, so in times of drought, they would camp down by plantations of this because it has so much fluid in it. The fluid in it is used like aloe vera, so if you've got a bite or a scratch, you can just rub the leaves onto your skin and it will relieve the bite. The leaves are actually edible and they make the most beautiful, almost like green bean dish. So I've been doing a lot of work out at the Juvenile Justice out at Campbelltown and teaching the kids all about, there's a lot of Indigenous children there, and we talk about the plants and then we cook it with a chef, and we made a really beautiful stir-fried carpet leaf sort of salad, and the kids loved it. It was like, it really tastes just like green beans. And then it has a fruit. So in the label, you can probably just vaguely see there's a bright pink flower. And after the flower formed is a fruit, and the fruit looks almost like a claw. And when you peel down the sides, there's a sort of a kind of, you know, like the consistency of a lychee. So it looks like a bit like a lychee, and it tastes a little bit like a salty strawberry. So I know that doesn't sound that attractive, but it actually is really nice. So my kids have learned how to identify these when we go to the beach, and they'll often go down there and grab some and have a good munch on those. But it's super tough, and this is one of those plants I say, if you can't garden, this is the plant for you, because mine is growing on the edge of a driveway and it's colonizing the driveway. It gets so much heat and not much love, and it looks absolutely fantastic. I was down at Kiama in summer, and they have enormous amounts of it growing along the beachfront. And if you go to Ostermere, near the beach there's lots of big plantations, and I'm sure there's some down in the Shire beaches too, because it's so super tough. And you can do it like a succulent. You can grow it from a leaf. So if you're into propagating, that's a really easy one to propagate as well. So, and then moving on to one of my other favorite ground covers, and you probably all know it, is the warrigal greens. That's another one that's super easy to grow from cuttings. So I grow that a lot. When I do my workshops up in Sydney, we do propagating as part of that workshop, and we propagate this from cuttings, and nearly everyone writes back that they've been successful. Funny story though, my neighbour, I came home from work one day, and I have a plantation of it it's about 6 meters long, kind of near the driveway, not on the driveway because I don't want it polluted, but I grow it because I make a lot of things with it for workshops. And I drove down the driveway and the whole thing had been whippersnipped. And I was like, oh my God, what has happened? And then I saw the neighbour and I said, you didn't happen to, and he interrupted me and he said, yeah, I got rid of all those weeds for you that were in that driveway garden. And when I told him what it was, that night he came over with a bottle of wine to say sorry. And he's now learnt something, because and it actually bounced back beautifully. So it was all right. But at the time I had a function for 100 people that I had to cater for, and it was destined for there. So it was a bit of a panic to find enough. But you'll find it down at Grace Point. I've seen it growing down there. And if you go camping down the south coast, there's a lot of warrigal greens going down there. I tend to blanch the leaves for about 60 seconds before I cook with it, because it's got quite a bit of oxalic acid in it. And all spinaches have that, but I just do it so you don't get a stomachache, because I make warrigal greens pesto with it. And it's always a hit. If you're making it at home, you can make it with roasted macadamias. When I take it to schools and things, I don't put the nuts in, but it's super delicious. And the beauty of it is, where basil will dry off, the warrigal greens is around all year, so you can always make yourself some pesto. So that's a really easy plant to grow too. It will start to pop up through your garden sometimes. You'll find it sort of appears suddenly. You'll think, oh, I thought I pulled that out, and it sort of comes back because it seeds quite readily. Does anyone grow it at home? No? Any shakes of the head there? Also, one of the ones that we found we got at the nursery recently, which we're waiting for some more stuff of it too, and this is a little gum tree, and it's Eucalyptus Oleda, and it doesn't look very significant on film, I'm sure, but it grows up north, sort of north of Coffs Harbour, and when you smell the leaves and when you grind it up, it's really super sweet. So you can actually use it in your sweet cooking. If you're a jam maker or you like doing desserts, then this enhances any fruit that you put in cooking. So I make strawberry gum bliss balls for people to try, because it tastes really beautiful with chocolate. But it's only a small gum, and it goes to about 6 meters. It gets really beautiful pink new growth. And surprisingly, it seems to have done quite well here. I've got one in a large pot because I wanted to be able to move it around. I didn't need another gum tree in the garden. But that's something interesting, because when you smell it, and if you come in the nursery, you can rub the leaves and have a smell. It doesn't have that eucalyptus smell at all. It's got it's distinctly sweet smell, very, very sweet. So one of my other favorites, how are we going for time? Am I still good? Yeah? You can let me know when I have to stop talking, because I'll just keep going. This is another little plant that probably doesn't look like much on film, and it's called Eucalyptus Oleda. So that was a bit of a mouthful. That's a really big Latin word to learn. But it's the rose myrtle. So it actually has, it sort of reminds me a bit of a cherry blossom tree. You know, get those little beautiful little cherry blossom flowers. And this one also can grow in full sun or full shade. So in the nursery, we've got it in 3 positions. We've got one in full sun, and it's grown to 6 meters. We've got one in full shade, and it's grown to sort of 2 to 3. And then we've got one that's in part shade and part sun, and that's still growing, but that's already up about 3 meters. It gets those beautiful cherry blossom flowers, and then in summer, and then it has a little red berry. So the berries start out green, and they go to yellow, then orange, then red, and that's when they're edible. So, and they seem to hang underneath the branches, so the birds seem to miss some of them, which is kind of good, because sometimes birds aren't very good at sharing. So, but that was just a plant that was eaten just for its fruit. But it's a really pretty underutilized tree. Like sometimes when people say they need a feature tree for their garden, I will suggest this, because I really like the habit of it. It's just that beautiful weeping habit. It looks a little bit similar to a lily pilly when you look at it in the pot, but as it grows, it's an absolutely stunning tree. Has anyone grown that or heard of that one? No? No? And then getting into the native mint. So if we go back down to our little ground covers, I love the mint, the native mint. So there's the Mentha australis, which has a much broader leaf. I know that's really hard to see there on the camera. And then there's Mentha saccharoides, which has a much tinier leaf. So the Mentha saccharoides tends to grow more as a flat ground cover, and the australis comes up quite a bit and has a much fleshier leaf. If you're using this mint in your cooking, you know how, like, if you were cooking, say, a tabbouleh and you would use a whole cup of mint, don't use a whole cup of this. It's too strong. You'd need maybe a tablespoon at the most. But I find what I love about these is, although they need a bit of moisture like your exotic mint, they can also go in full sun. So they don't need, you know how your exotic mint needs shade and it's a little bit fussy and it gets rust and then it invades your whole garden. Well, these mints don't tend to do that. So they will grow as a ground cover. I know in the nursery we have the saccharoides growing under a finger lime quite beautifully. And it's just a really beautiful, fragrant plant. If you had it near a border or a pathway and you were treading on it, you'd be releasing all those beautiful smells all the time. So they're a really hardy little ground cover. I don't know if anyone's used those before, but it's just something that we're not sort of used to, these herbs. Like we got some native basil in recently, and all the sort of the prostanthus and things like that. Like, sort of people are reaching for, you know, your usual herbs in the garden or even in the pantry, and you wouldn't hesitate to use rosemary and you wouldn't hesitate to use thyme. But because of the sort of the lack of knowledge and also availability, because I don't know if you find that it's really hard to find these things in the shops. They don't generally have these ingredients, dried ingredients. I know recently I'd run out of wattle seed and my supply, because I buy it in bulk, was out. And the only place I was able to find it was in a deli. But I think that's getting better. And the industry is now run by Indigenous people, so they're protecting their rights as well. But for us as gardeners, and you're all passionate gardeners, then try some of these plants in the garden, because not only are they attractive and they get beautiful flowers and you're creating habitat, you're able to eat the plants. So it's sort of this multiple use for the plants, which I think is just fantastic. And sort of, as you might have heard with some of the species I've talked about, you've probably seen them in the nursery or you've even grown them before, but sometimes we just don't know how to eat it. So that's sort of where I'm trying to bridge the gap between growing these beautiful plants, but also being able to, how do you use it? Because people don't know. I mean, sort of the master chefs and all those shows are starting to get a bit better at that, but I'm finding we're sort of, we need to learn a bit more, really. Am I going okay for time, Pam, or are we good? Yeah, I'm all good. Okay, There's quite a few climbers as well that are edible. I'll just go through a couple of those because I know we're going to run out of time. But Bellaria scandens, now you probably all know that. Bellaria scandens, it doesn't look very much. It's pretty insignificant in the pot. Gets beautiful little tubular flowers, a little bit similar to a coria. And these actually have sweet fruit, because I find a lot of the fruits, a lot of the indigenous fruits are quite sour. Like you find, you know, your Davidson's plums are super sour, even your lily pillies can be a bit sour, and your Illawarra plums a bit sour. But this one has really sweet fruit. So the fruit are about the size of a licorice bullet. That's kind of my best reference. And they're green, and they kind of go from green to almost dark greenish black. And when you eat them, they're really beautiful and sweet. So this climber loves the shade. It can take a bit of sun though, and it's quite bushy, because a lot of the native edible climbers I find are quite open and a little bit leggy, and you'll find them sometimes in the bush. They'll be more scrambling on the ground than actually climbing up a tree. But I find Bellaria is fantastic. I grew it at my parents' house. We created a screen, and we screened off their hot water service with this. And I said, you know, next time you're out there checking it, make sure you get the fruit. They were going to put this fruit on the market as a fruit that we could buy at the greengrocers, but what happened is the fruit doesn't ripen at once, it just keeps ripening over time. So it was really hard for them to harvest, because they had to keep going back and back and back. There wasn't sort of one time that it was being able to be harvested. So that's really beautiful. It looks much better when it's growing than it does in that little pot. And then there's also the Eustress. So, sorry, I'll just grab some of these. There's Eustress, and there's a Gytinoplasmum, which is like a really spindly looking leaf with these enormously long sort of climbing strings. And you can actually eat the tuber under the ground as well as the fruit of these little scrambling kind of climbers. What's good about these climbers in a permaculture sense, because I talk about growing like the 7 levels of fruit, these could actually be growing up a tree, and it doesn't kill the tree. You know how some climbers, like if you had ivy or something like that, and it actually gets on the tree and kills the tree. Well, these don't. They just use it as a very light support, so that you can easily climb it up a tree, and it's not going to affect anything, and you'll just have some beautiful blooms and some edible food at the same time. But they do like the shade, so that's one that you'd have to use in the shade. But that's fantastic, because we've all got somewhere in the garden that needs a shade plant, right? Even your grasses, like I find with the grasses, like even your trusty old lamandra, which I often call the council plant, because they grow that so because you can't kill it. And then your Dianella, which is also grown as a plant. They would use the lamandra stems, particularly down the bottom, for starch, so that if you pull a leaf out, you can actually chew on the end of it, and that gave you quite a good carbohydrate. But they also did a lot of weaving with that. So this little, I don't know whether you can see, but I made this little basket out of lamandra leaves, and it's like a little basket, and even the string, and that's some of the lenu feathers. And one of the aunties taught me how to weave this, and she said when you were born, your auntie or your grandmother or your mother would make you this little basket, and it would also, in it would go your first piece of hair, and your first tooth that you lose, and something important to you, and then you would get given it when you became of age, which is about 13. So that was a really special little basket. But we just wove that. We picked some of those lamandra leaves, and we let them dry for a couple of weeks, and then we kind of re-wet them so that they went soft again. And then obviously it completely dries out eventually, but that was a really nice thing to, and that's where I was talking about they had multiple uses for lots of the plants. And the same with Dianella. So Dianella, we all know, likes to colonize areas, and the nicest edible Dianella is Cerulean. Some of the other ones you probably shouldn't eat, like Tas Red, don't eat that one. But I find the fruit clings to these for a really long time, so you need to pick them when you first notice they become ripe, because if they've been on the shrub for too long, they become very bitter. But they also used to use the leaves. So next time you're with your Dianella, pull some leaves out, and they're slightly hollow, and they were used as a snake whistle. So they were used to create vibrations and to warn people about snakes that were coming, and also to make a piercing noise that was sort of, sometimes they said it was to bring the snakes out because they actually used to eat them. And then other times it was to sort of drive them away. So it's a really, it does colonize your garden though. If anyone's growing Dianella and then realize they've now got a whole paddock of it, that's quite common. So it is something that if you've got an area which you don't know what to do with and under a tree, then that's a really good place for your Dianellas. Are we still good for time? Yeah? I'll just do a couple more and then we'll finish up. So native raspberries, they have quite a few thorns. The kids get very clever at pulling jumpers over their hands and things to get the fruit because a lot of them are fruiting right now. The best native raspberry is Rubus probus, which is the Atherton raspberry. That has a really big fruit. Whereas I find parvifolius and parviflorus, they've got quite small fruit and some of them are a little bit tasteless, whereas I find that probus is absolutely delicious. I was at a school last week out at Toongabbie and theirs were covered in fruit, and I just stood there with the kids and we probably ate about 20 raspberries each. They'd let theirs grow into a thicket, and I know people worry about that because it can get quite brambly, but I just set up a trellis and I kind of weave my canes in and out, and then you can easily pick the fruit, and you can also, when the canes are finished, you can cut them at the bottom and just whip them out from the bottom. So that would definitely be my pick for the raspberries. Someone must be growing raspberries or seen them in the bush recently. Has anyone been bushwalking and seen them in the bush? No, maybe not. So other than that, we've got things like violas. You can eat the leaves and the flowers. You've got all your lily pillies. So my favorite lily pillies is probably, I like the syzygiums. You can eat all the lily pillies, but some of them aren't that nice. If you want to use something like a cascade or one of the smaller berry types, you can actually boil those berries up in a pot. And once the water changes colour, then you can squeeze the berries through the muslin and you will get that very distinct lily pilly flavour in the jam. So, but I would use some of the Acamina smithii are great for fruit. The Syzygium lumanii, which I love for its pink new growth, like that's a really good one to eat. So, and the backyard bliss, the Syzygium backyard bliss, which everyone's using as a hedge, is beautiful fruit. So I make a lot of jam for that with that, which has a nice sort of tart flavour, but also grows really beautifully. Even during that summer heat, they seem to survive extremely well, which is really good. And just one last one I'll go through before we run out of time. Melastoma athene, I don't know whether anyone's grown that. It's sometimes called the native tipicina or the blue tongue. And basically the reason it gets called blue tongue is because when you eat the fruit, it actually stains your tongue blue. So kids like that, they think that's fantastic. The only thing I would say with this plant is it needs shade and it needs moisture. It will get very unhappy if you're not giving it enough moisture, and it will get very droopy. You'll see that happen, and I know plenty of people that have killed them. So it's a really beautiful little shrub, only to 1 metre, gets really bushy and gets that beautiful purple flower, just like the tipicinas, the exotic tipicina. So that's another really good, particularly if you're doing something like a cottage garden, say, and you really wanted to get that sort of cottage look, you could do that. So I think with all these plants, I mean, there's many more that I could go through. I think it's just trialing them. Like a lot of, as you can see by what I've said, a lot of them are growing in the shade quite beautifully. So for people who are having trouble with shade plants, or they've got quite big trees that are casting a lot of shade, then a lot of these plants do beautifully as an understory. What I'm going to do is I'll send through to Margaret and Pam, I have quite detailed notes with a picture, the heights and the edible parts of the plant. So I'll send that through and they can share it with you, because it's hard to remember all that information. And then you can come and see me in the nursery and we can talk about your garden, and hope that you get some of these in there, even just for their own sake, because they're beautiful. But there's a huge range. There's things like lemon aspen. There's a lot of rainforest trees like the native guavas. Everyone knows native macadamias. So it'd be good to get those sort of species into your garden too, because, and not everything has to be a tree. Like I said, you know how when you read the label of a plant, it's so ambiguous. It'll say 2 to 12 meters, and you sort of think, well, which is it? I mean, it's kind of crazy. So as I say to people, if you put in something that looks like a tree, it's not going to grow overnight. You will get a chance to prune it. And you can prune them quite beautifully into shrubs. Like I have a sandpaper fig, which is the nicest fig tree, and I've kept that to a 3-meter shrub. I didn't let it go into a tree because I wanted the area it was in, I wanted it to grow a lot smaller. So so sort of play around with it a bit. I think you guys, you're experienced gardeners anyway, so you'll know what to do. But pruning them, keeping them bushy, the bushier they are, the more fruit you'll get, or the more foliage you'll get to use in your garden. And I hope that you'll let me know what you've put in and how you've used them. If you want to come and see me, I'm in the nursery Tuesdays and Fridays. The rest of the time I'm doing talks like this, or I'm out and about consulting on people's gardens. But I'm quite happy for you to come and have a chat about your specific areas. You can bring a photo if you like, and we can talk about. And we'll get Lloyd to get a few more bush foods into the garden up there, huh? When he's allowed to. When he's allowed to.